That was fascinating, profound, and profoundly important to the challenges that Israel, America, and Western society and the world in general face. So thank you very much for that, and thank you for showing us the connection that binds this conference together, which brings together the Department of Political Studies. And Daniel Elazar insisted that it would be called Political Studies and not Political Science, but in a classic Israeli compromise in Hebrew, it's called Political Science. So political studies on the one hand and Jewish philosophy on the other hand. I'd like now to open the floor to questions. What I'm going to do is, if you ask the question to me, then I'll read it into the microphone for Professor Putnam. Yes?
It's not really a question, just a clarification that in his most, I think his last book called Morality, Jonathan Sacks, early in the book, he brings this whole story of 1831. Because he said it wasn't written.
Yeah, so just to note there that Jonathan Sacks managed to find a place for that story in Morality, in the book Morality. So it's there, it is there as well as the last lecture. Yes, question from the back.
I brought a similar question up in the Rabbi Ben Mosek conference a couple weeks ago. You have these ideas that are twisted and horribly hurt humanity. Darwin's theory of evolution and survival of the fittest was twisted into policies that basically said if people are overworked at factories and get sick or die, too bad, right? I mean, so how do you have these ideas that got terribly twisted into survival of the fittest and hurt millions of people? How do you prevent that?
Okay, that's a nice easy one. Charles Darwin's theory of survival of the fittest got twisted into the social Darwinism of...
Yes.
Yeah. So the question is, how did it happen and how can we prevent it from happening?
What a really good question. First of all, we just need to, I mean, I'm sure the questioner and I both understand this. Darwin himself was not a social Darwinist. The social Darwinists, who were very dominant in American public philosophy, actually, at the end of the 19th century, they observed, look, Darwin says, red in truth and competition, the devil take the hindmost. That worked, they said, Darwin says that works in natural society. Let's apply the same thing to human society, and therefore they said, for example, some just unbelievably dumb things. They said, we would all be better off if the world would be better off if rich people did not give anything away, because that's only sustaining the less healthy genes. I mean, so it led directly to racism, and frankly, it led directly to the Holocaust. That social Darwinism is a direct line between the social Darwinists and the show. Darwin himself, as I said, did not hold that view. He held, in fact, the opposite view, that human evolution was encouraged by altruism. So I've now just stated the dilemma, I've restated what the questioner asked, which is how did that happen? And honestly, to some extent, I don't know, because when you actually state it the way I just did, that the social Darwinists were saying we're all better off, it's morally right if we sacrifice the least able people to the most able people, that seems just despicable. How could anybody have thought that? And all I can conclude is that it was intimately bound up with the racism of that period. That is, in fact, they were racist. That's the true fact. They were racist with respect to blacks. They were racist with respect to Jews. They were just racist, those social Darwinists. And they were drawing on what was at that point the pop culture enthusiasm about Darwin. So I guess what we have to say is we've got to think always carefully and not make simple-minded translations from one field into another field. I mean, it's a good question. I wish I had a better answer.
Thank you. Yes, at the back.
I recently saw a podcast where Darwin was used to describe lobsters, and then used that as a parallel to tell us basically again that, you know, in these days capitalism should be in favour of the rich, and therefore that's kind of self-selection. And often these theories seem to correlate also with a more fundamentalist religious grouping. Does the professor see a connection between those two things?
Okay, so the question is that we've spoken about survival of the fittest in capitalist terms, in sort of a brutal capitalism. The questioner asks, can we see that also a connection is feeding into religious fundamentalism or religious extremism? Is there a connection there between a Darwinist, a social Darwinist influence on that kind of thing?
Right, I understand the question perfectly well, and so did Jonathan Sachs actually understand this question perfectly well. I'm a little bit reluctant to an Israeli audience at exactly this period to get into this discussion of Orthodox religion and religious extremism and so on, because I don't want to have a misstep here, and I know that anything I say from this point on is likely to get me in trouble with somebody. And maybe we could get Jonathan Sachs in trouble with somebody. Jonathan was very clear. He was himself very tolerant. He was, of course, thoroughly Jewish, but he was very, very tolerant. And I know, I don't want to get too far into this, but I personally am a convert to Judaism. He could strictly, I wasn't really Jewish because I had not been converted by an Orthodox rabbi, and yet we had immensely close discussions of religion, and he was personally probably the most tolerant, religiously tolerant person I know. And I'm glad to know that his ideas about Tocqueville and Darwin have appeared in writing in the book Morality. I did not know that, but in the article, the lecture actually is long, and in that he makes very clear that what is needed is that the moral basis of society needs to be religion, and he almost says it doesn't matter what kind of religion, he just didn't have to be religion. At one point he suggests. Now, I'll be careful, because of course he wasn't a devout Jew, I understand that, but let me speak for myself. I do think there's a connection between religious extremism and this emphasis today on I and not we. That is, in America, let me speak about America, not about Israel. In America, though you would think that evangelical Protestants, the most extreme evangelical Protestants, would be focused on the we, right? If you read the Sermon on the Mount, for example, speaking of Christianity, read the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus was for sure a communitarian. He didn't say, good for the rich and the devil take the hindmost. He said, it's harder for a rich man to get into heaven than for a camel to go through the eye of a needle. Read the Sermon on the Mount. So you would think that evangelical Protestants would be very focused on our obligations to one another. They, at the moment, seem to be caught up in this excessively focus on self-salvation, not on what we should do to other people. I'm afraid that was maybe a little confusing because I was trying to avoid controversy, but I probably plunged myself even deeper in controversy.
Okay, well, I think you did extremely well in navigating that, but there will be headlines. Yes. Yes, Josh.
We spent 2 days hearing Jews talk to Jews about a great Jew. I was wondering if Professor Putnam could share a little bit with us about how the relationship began and what its nature was with Rabbi Sachs, and also what strikes him about Rabbi Sachs's work and thought. Okay,
let's see if I can get this right. We spent 2 days of Jews talking to Jews about a great Jew.
Right.
What we'd like to know from you is a little bit about how you and Rabbi Sachs began to develop your relationship, a little bit about your discussions, and about what you think Rabbi Sachs is significant.
What strikes him about his work?
What stands out for you about his work?
It's a complicated story, actually, and I'll try to be brief. I am a convert to Judaism. I converted to Judaism more than 60 years ago, At the time, I was dating a young woman who was Jewish. We spent a lot of time trying to figure out what to do. I convinced myself that, I'm sorry, being personal about my own religion, but it's relevant to the question of Rabbi Sachs. I apologize for this personal digression. Long story short, I started hanging out with this young woman. We're still hanging out. She's actually in the other room. And we had 2 kids. Both of our kids fell in love with non-Jews, and we could hardly object to that because we were. But then their partners converted to Judaism too. So now we started with 1 Jew, Rosemary, and we now have 4 Jews. Rosemary and me and our 2 kids, and their spouses, no, 7 or 8 Jews. We then have 7 grandchildren, and all of them are bar mitzvah or bar mitzvah. So now we have, from 1 Jew, 1 million. For 1 million, for purposes of 1 million. I'm a Reformed Jew, so we do count women as so I think of myself as fully Jewish. And this is the point I wanted to make. Strictly speaking, and Rabbi Sachs and I talked about this. Strictly speaking, he did not consider me a Jew. And he was a little uneasy about my grandchildren, whether they were Jews. Of course, it was matrilineal, but nevertheless, when he learned that my youngest grandson was being bar mitzvah, he handed me, I'm going to tear up now, he handed me a signed by Rabbi Sachs, a copy of the Holy Book. And, I mean, what I'm trying to say is, we bonded actually over being Jews in a strange way, even though I'm a convert, he doesn't believe in conversion. You see what I'm trying to say? That's where we connected. I'm sorry we've gotten so personal about that. So let me step back. He learned about my work first because he read about social capital, and I learned about his work, and therefore we met, and we corresponded for a long time transatlantically. Then I went and visited him several times in London. That's when he handed me this book for my grandson. And so we had also a personal relationship. That's what I'm trying to convey. What I'm trying to say is, I can't say what a non-Jew really thinks of Rabbi Sachs, because in the fundamental ways, I'm a Jew. Let me say this in part. I'm a Jew, wholeheartedly a Jew, because Judaism is such a communal religion. Judaism is not about theology. Indeed, studies have shown, my own studies have shown, most Jews in America are atheists. But what makes them Jews and what makes them think they're Jews correctly is they're part of a community. So there's a non-accidental connection between Judaism and communitarianism, and Rabbi Sachs' work embodies that, and I'm along for the ride.
That was very moving, and it also speaks to a lot of the papers that have been presented here today. Yes, Professor Kaplan.
Yeah, I have to ask you, that's right.
Yeah.
So someone asked a question about the distortion of Darwin into type of social Darwinism. I remember the person whom I read, a moral philosopher who opposed this based on her knowledge of biology, was Mary Midgley, who very much emphasized Darwin in terms of cooperation, in terms of emotions, and also Midgley is very much opposed to the solitary self and moral isolationism like Rabbi Sachs. And I seem to remember, there are people who are much more expert, that Rabbi Sachs was influenced or in dialogue with Midgley. So maybe you might want to comment on that.
Okay. Mary Midgley, does the name mean something to you? And if it does...
I'm sorry, not.
No, okay. So we'll pass on that one. Yes.
I apologize.
Yeah, okay. Yes.
Very few of us are absolute individualists or absolute communitarians. That is, very few of us think only about the I and totally neglect the we, and vice versa. So it seems to me that for the real serious problem in life is how do we navigate the balance between the two?
Okay.
And I'm wondering if Professor Putnam would like to share his wisdom about that.
Okay. Very few of us are either an I or a B completely. How do we find, in practice and conceptually, the correct balance between the two?
Well, the first point is that the fact that there's not just, communitarianism all good and individualism all bad, which would be a simple-minded way of reading some work. Both Rabbi Sachs and I learned from Tocqueville and Darwin that you can't treat those as separate polar cases. So the first thing to say is, not only do I agree with the questioner that none of us is either purely individualist or purely communitarian. What I have learned from the Darwin, well, I've learned partly from Jonathan Sachs, but partly from the comparison between Tocqueville and Darwin, is that a fuller conception, and Rabbi Sachs, I'm almost quoting Rabbi Sachs now, a fuller conception has got to understand that there are times and places when individualism is appropriate or maybe just necessary, and times and places when we have to think about our obligations to others. He, for example, said, and I'm now just quoting this lecture that he gave at NYU, he said there are spheres, economic spheres, for example, which are zero-sum. You get a raise or I get a raise, but we can't both have the same dollar. And he also thought that power was essentially zero-sum. Actually, I don't agree with that. I think that power is not a zero-sum concept that both you and I can gain by finding a mutual compromise. I don't have any theoretical reconciliation in response to the questioner. I don't have a theoretical reconciliation of exactly when we have to think about it, when we should think about ourselves as individuals, and when we should think about ourselves as communitarians. And of course, if we delve deeper into this, I don't have time for that, but we belong to many different communities. So we have obligations to some communities, like our family, and other obligations to other communities. And so I don't think, A, I don't think this is a simple problem, and B, I don't think Jonathan Sachs thought it was a simple problem. I mean, he says, this is something that we have to wrestle with. There's not a simple geometric answer to the question, when should we be individualists and when should we be communitarians? I do think that both he and I thought, and this is where I would put my flag, both he and I thought that whatever the right balance is between the I and the we, contemporary Western society, and above all contemporary America, is way unbalanced toward the I right now. I mean, and there are millions of examples of that, and actually, when I began writing about this 20 or 30 years ago, that was a controversial position. Now almost everybody in America agrees that America is stuck in dramatic overemphasis on the I. So whatever the right balance is between individualism and communitarianism, right now we're just way out of balance, way polarized politically, way unequal economically, way disconnected. If you have to say there was one thing wrong with America now that explains everything, it is that we're too focused on I. So I'm not yet worried about, could we get too far the other way? I want to say now, what I'm worried about is getting us back on track to a more we society.
Thank you. And the final question from Professor Adam Persiger.
Thank you very much, Professor Putnam. One of the things that's been discussed quite a bit is Rabbi Sachs as a public intellectual. He predicated his career on the rabbinate and public roles. You are based in the academy, but you certainly have that in common. And really taking from what you just left off, 30 years ago, you wrote Bowling Alone, which essentially raised these issues, and it raised a lot of discussion. Nonetheless, you are saying now that there's a frustration because the tide has just moved even further. So could you just talk a little bit about how you see a public intellectual being able to impact on society and what you have in mind when you think about writing the books and speaking about the issues that you speak about?
Did you catch that?
I got most of it, yeah. And if I understood it correctly, that is, what's the role of public intellectual? And, in a way, my career proves that public intellectuals have no effect. I mean, I've been preaching. Actually, there's a little bit of a preacher in me, in fact. Or as one person said, he's like an Old Testament prophet with charts. I really like that epithet. So I've been preaching, but that's, prophets, Isaiah or all the rest of them, they knew what it was like to be preaching and not having anybody listen. So I comfort myself in that respect. Well, that's an terribly self-centered kind of comment, putting myself in the same category as Isaiah. Look, I am, my most recent book, I'm not trying to sell more books, but my most recent book is very specifically aimed at trying to change America. Trying to maybe not change history, but bend history a little bit. And that over the course of my career, I gradually moved from being, as I get older actually, I gradually moved from trying to be descriptive, thoughtfully descriptive, to being very prescriptive. And I won't bother this audience with my prescriptions of American society, but I have, in this book called The Upswing, How We Came Together a Century Ago and How We Can Do It Again, I lay out some very specific things we ought to do, some of which are happening now, actually, in the aftermath of the defeat of Trump, or at least the so far defeat of Trump. By the way, I want to emphasize, just to avoid misunderstanding, this trend toward I and away from me predates Trump by 40 or 50 years. Trump is a symptom of America becoming an excessively I society. And it took us a long time to get here, and even if Trump is, defeated and ends up on the dustbin of history, we still have this problem. It's not going to go away, but it means a lot of things. But finally, I'm sorry I've gone on so long, but this is true. As in the book, this most recent book, my co-author, Shannon Garrett, and I conclude that the first thing that has to happen is there has to be a moral reawakening in America. This is the social sciences saying this. We have to have a moral reawakening in America, pay more attention to our obligations to other people. And it's not that we say change some policy, we twist this policy knob and suddenly we're in a better position. We won't begin to twist that policy knob until large numbers of Americans, and this has happened before in American history, become seized of their moral obligations. So, in the end, I guess I kind of think preachers, in this sort of secular preachers, have to play a crucial role if we're going to get out of this fixed world. I'm sorry to go on so long.
Professor Putnam, thank you so much, not only for a wonderful lecture.
Thank you all.
But not only for a wonderful lecture, but Jonathan Sacks had a tradition of doing conversations, public conversations with leading public intellectuals. And while he couldn't be here in person, I felt that we somehow managed at least to retain a resemblance of that tradition. So thank you very much for engaging in such a wonderful conversation as well.
Thank you all very much.